Today's daf we're going to be learning is Horayot Afav. Today's daf is sponsored by Tina Lamb's children in memory of their grandfather Mike Sender Zichrono Levarcha from Cleveland, Ohio, and later Boca Raton, Florida. He dedicated much of his life to growing strong Jewish institutions, and his passion for Judaism, Torah, and Tefillah serves as a constant inspiration for us. May his neshama have an aliyah and his memory be for our blessed. Okay, the Siyum is coming up in a week. We just started, and yet we have a Siyum. So there'll be a Siyum Sunday on Zoom, a really good program with most of our Beyond the Daf content writers. Dr. Ayelet Hoffman-Libson will be speaking, Alana Stein-Hain, and Yael Shimoni from Gefet. So we have all the gamut of our extra contents, and we're going to have both. It'll be the theme will be related to Rosh Hashanah and Tshuva from Sugyot and Nizikin. Plus, we will have Alana will give a good introduction to Kodashim to get us kind of into some Masechet that really needs some introduction to get us into the world of Kodashim. And more like the significance of what it is we're going to be learning. And for those in Israel, I highly recommend coming to join our Siyum Seder Nizikin that will take place on Monday night in Jerusalem, a live event, which we don't usually get to do, a big event. So that will be exciting. And Julie Mendelson will also be celebrating a Siyum Shas with us. So that will be very exciting. And the details of the Siyum for Sunday have not gone up yet, the English Siyum. They will go up as Ezra Hashem today. It's been a very busy period with all the Siyums and end of the summer and all that. Hopefully today or tomorrow, the registration will go up for that. And the Siyum for the Hebrew is already up. And if you want to come, you have to register before because we're limited with space and reserve soon so you don't get closed out. Okay, we're going to get started. Tanya, Rabbi Shimon Omer. We're going to start from the bottom of Hamlet Bet. And what we're going to do today is we're going to bring two braita mainly and deal with them. So the first braita we're breaking, which we started in yesterday's daf, we'll read again, is going to be brought because it's going to raise a difficulty. We saw these different opinions. Who brings the Parhalem Davar Shel Tzibur? Do we bring, right? Who brings? How many are brought? All the tribes. One, right? The people. Is it the Beit Din? Is it the people and the Beit Din? So we had a range of different opinions. We're going to try to figure out, this braita is going to raise a difficulty with one of the opinions. And then we're going to be stuck, even though normally you say that braita just doesn't hold by this opinion. But in this case, they're quoting a pasuk from the Tanakh, and they're going to say, how does Rabbi Meir read this pasuk? Then we'll resolve it, and then we'll ask some other questions on the braita and have some difficulties with what we learned. And that's the first sugya. So Tanya, starting 3 lines from the bottom of Hamlet Bet, Rabbi Shimon Omer, Ma Talmud lomar upar sheni ben bakar tikach lechatat, im lelamed shem shnayim v'lo kfar ne'emar v'asat chatat et achad ola l'Hashem. So we're talking about these korbanot the Levites brought. Comes up in Sefer Bamidbar when they became kind of Levites and started working in their jobs. They had special korbanot miluim of the Levim. So it says they bring the second part that they bring is a chatat. So the Gemara says, but the braita says, but understand, why are you telling us the second? To say there's another one, there's another bull offering, but it already said, bring one burnt and one chatat. Now the main difference between a chatat and an ola, besides other differences, but the ola burns completely, and the chatat is, the meat gets eaten by the kohanim, okay, the male kohanim. So there's a difference. So now they say, why are they bothering to tell us that the second, to say there's a first, right? Why don't you just say the par for the chatat? And we know one's olah, one's chatat. So it says, Yechol lo ne'echelet l'leviim, Talmud lomar, upar sheni la'olam, ma olah lo ne'echelet, av chatat lo ne'echelet. The reason why they said second is it's second to the olah, meaning it's the same as the olah. Just like the olah is not eaten, this specific chatat was not eaten. Okay, so even though all sin offerings are eaten, this one wasn't. Kayotsebo. And then furthermore, meaning the exact same thing we're going to see in another sugya, and that's what's going to interest us. So the second part of this braita quotes, okay, Kayotsebo Amar Rabbi Yossi. They say Rabbi Yossi said there was another one like this, a sin offering that wasn't eaten. And how do we know? We're going to see right now. Haba'im ma'ashevi b'nei agola, hikrivu olot lelohei Israel, parim shnei masar. Okay, I'll read the rest of the pasuk in a minute, or maybe I'll just paraphrase it. But when in the time of Ezra, when they came back to Israel, there was this big event, and they brought a slew of korbanot. You're going to be kind of shocked by the numbers. 12 bull offerings. Then they brought rams, 96. Kfasim, sheep, shiv'im v'shiv'ah, 77. And sfirei chatat shnei masar. And goats for sin offerings, 12. Now notice here, forget about these gigantic numbers of the rams and the sheep. but we have 12 parim and 12 seirim. Now, what does this sound like? Paralim davar shel tzibur, right? Where you have, if you did a sin relating to avodah zarah, you bring a bull and you bring a goat. That's what we saw yesterday, and potentially you could get to 12, right? In different, depending on which opinions, and that's exactly what we're going to see right now. So they're assuming that this was a paralim davar shel tzibur, and that's why there's 12 and 12. We'll get back to later why the 77 and all that. Did I say the number right? 96 and 77. Yeah, we'll get back to that at the very end. So the really strange part of this pasuk is, though, after it lists all the korbanot you're supposed to bring, and it ends with these sin offerings, hakol olah Hashem. Everything was an olah, burnt offering to God. Okay, so the Gemara, the braita asks, hakol olah, how could it be hakol olah sal kadatach? How could you say they're all burnt offerings? Efshar shechatat olah, right? Maybe all the other ones were olah because it didn't say. But how could you possibly say that the sin offering was an olah? A sin offering is a sin offering, and olah is a burnt offering. They're not the same. Ela hakol, right? This is good intro to Zvachim. Okay, that we're going to start soon with all the korbanot. Ela hakol ke'olah. Everything was like an olah, exactly like the previous. Now you know why he said kayotze, just like this. Ma'olah lo ne'echelet, af chatat lo ne'echelet. Okay, just like the olah is not eaten, the chatat wasn't eaten either. And here we have another example where the sin offering wasn't eaten. Okay. Now we're going to have another braita about this, which is going to put this in the category, what I said before, of the paralim davar shel tzibur. Tanya Rabbi Yehuda Omer al avodat kochavim hivi'im. Okay, what was this about? It was about idol worship, and that's why they had the seirim and the goats and the bulls. But Amar Rabbi Yehuda Amar Shmuel. So that is a Tanaitic source that said this was for avodah zarah. And now the question is, what avodah zarah are we talking about? So Amar Rabbi Yehuda Amar Shmuel al avodat kochavim shasu b'mei Zedekiah. We're talking about, okay, this is historically, Zedekiah was the last king before the destruction. So before the destruction, which now they're 70 years later, back into Israel, they're now bringing a sin offering for something that was done at least 70 years ago, if not more. And that's going to raise a whole bunch of questions. But right now, we're going to deal with our first question, which is, okay, let's try to understand what's going on here and whose opinion does this accord with. Now remember Rabbi Yehuda's position. Rabbi Yehuda says, even if only one shevet sins, and all the more so if the majority sin, right? Each shevet is their own community, their own kahal. They each have to bring a sin offering, a bull, right? And in this case, it would be a bull and a goat because it was avodah zarah. And, right, and even if one sins, it's called greira. They pull everybody in. Everybody's responsible. This is like the idea that we're all responsible for other people's sins. And each tribe has to bring their own sin offerings. So that makes perfect sense. 12 bull offerings could be a whole bunch of permutations. The Gemara gives 2. There could even be more. You could find why we have 12. Okay, first of all, easy case. All 12 tribes sin, so each one brings their own bull offering. Demaite, right, and goat offerings. Demaite shnemasar seirim. Inami dechatu shiv'a shvatim ushara inach b'greira. Or 7 sinned, and the others have to do it anyway because that's his whole point. Greira brings, each tribe has to bring their own sin offering. So it even could have said 1 sinned, right? If 1 sins, remember, there was the case that Rabbi Yehuda said 1 sin based on their own court. That's a different one. But if 1 sin based on the Beit Din Agadol, then every tribe has to bring. Okay, because the Beit Din Agadol covers everyone. If it's only their own Beit Din, then they would have to bring just 1. But if it's the whole Beit Din, the Beit Din Agadol did it, and one tribe sinned, every single shevet, even that, according to Rabbi Yehuda. Okay, they don't bring that case, but that could also be another case. So Rabbi Yehuda fits in perfectly. Rabbi Shimon. Now, what's Rabbi Shimon? Rabbi Shimon said the people, right, each tribe that sinned, not greira, he doesn't add all the extras, each tribe that sinned and the Beit Din. So how do you get to 12? If 11 tribes sin, that's how you get to 12. Each tribe brings, right? Demaitu achadasar sirim v'idach debating. Maitu means bring. This is going to be a very tricky word today because maite, or sometimes maitu, is also going to be died. We're going to talk about, okay, it's going to be very tricky because we're going to keep flipping back that word. Sometimes it means to bring, and sometimes it means to die, like from mate. So I'm just going to each time translate it the right way so you know which one is which. So Maitu is they bring achadasar sirim, and then the 12th is the Beit Din. Now, Ela le Rabbi Meir de Amal Beit Din mivi'im velo tzibur. Now, what about Rabbi Meir? Rabbi Meir is not going to fit in at all because Rabbi Meir says the court brings and not the community at all. That means there should be one offering, not right, one bull and one goat, not more than that. So, how can you get to a case of 12? So that's really why the Gemara brought this braita, for this question. However, they're going to get off on a whole big tangent onto other stuff. So the answer is very simple, although a little hard to imagine. It's talking about that they sin 12 times with the Avodah Zarah. Now, why is it a little unrealistic? It's not so crazy to think they sin 12 times with the Avodah Zarah, but it would have to be that the court ruled something incorrectly, the people sinned, then they found out it was a mistake, and then they stopped, and then they, again, ruled a mistake, okay? And the mistake happened 12 times, and the people followed the mistake 12 times. The majority of the population, right? It would be a little bit hard to imagine, but at least they come up with an explanation. Okay, that's our answer. So we brought this to say this source. Now, again, as I said in the beginning, and now you'll understand it because now we already read it. It's always easier when you see it inside. The issue is that if Rabbi Meir, who's living in the time of the Tanaim, is correct about that it's only the Beit Din, it doesn't really work with this pasuk. Okay, at least the way the Mishnah, the braita understood the pasuk, that the pasuk was a paralim davar shel tzibur, and then it doesn't really fit in. And the Gemara comes up with an explanation. Now the Gemara is going to ask another two questions on this. So our first question is, V'ham maite lehu hanu dechatu. But wait, the people who sinned died already, right? We assume a lifespan is about 70 years of people, especially in those days. And basically, no one's alive anymore. How can you give a sin offering for something that was in the past? Okay, when the people are no longer alive. Okay, and there's a whole thing we're going to learn about these chamesh chataot metot. Okay, the mate is going to also relate sometimes to the people, sometimes to the animal. It's also a little bit confusing in today's stuff. The chamesh chataot metot is a topic we're going to learn a lot, which is there's lots of cases, we're going to learn this in Zvachim, where you have an animal that you designated for a sacrifice. It can no longer be used for that sacrifice. Okay, the classic example is I designated an animal, then I lost the animal because the animal wandered away. Then, so it was already sanctified. Then I bring a new animal. I sacrifice that new animal. And now the old animal, I find it. So now when I'm stuck because it was already sanctified, but it can't be used for this korban, because assuming, let's say it's a sin offering or a guilt offering or something like that, I only need one offering. It's not like I could bring the other one voluntarily. There's no voluntary sin offering. You're only bringing a sin offering if you're obligated one. So what do I do with that animal? So if it's an asham, depending on what it is, it's usually left to graze until it gets a mumik, blemish, can no longer be valid to be sacrificed. You redeem it, turn it into money, right? Sell it, take the money, buy a voluntary offering like an Ola offering, bring a voluntary burnt offering to the temple. That's the easiest solution. But there's a tradition, a halacha l'Moshe Sinai, which we'll come back to at the end of today's talk, which says there's 5 chataot that are left to die. You can't do anything with that animal. You can't redeem it at all. It's a tradition. One of them is the case I just said, okay, where you already, it's called nitkapu ba'alav. They already got atonement. Okay, that's one. But the relevant one for our purposes is if, let's say, someone designates a sacrifice, an animal for a sacrifice, and then they die, okay, metu ba'aleha. They were supposed to bring a sin offering, and now they die. Now, that animal can't be brought as a sin offering because the person's dead, okay? So that means that if the people who are supposed to bring the sin offering die, there is no sacrifice in its place. Nobody sacrifices it for them. And in fact, that animal that was designated has to die, but that's an indicator that this is done, right? It's the end game. So how could they possibly be atoning for a sin that for people who are dead? There is no such thing. A chatat shemetu ba'aleh is never sacrificed, okay? It's left to die. So how do we deal with this? Amar Papa, ki gemiri chatat shemetu ba'aleh b'mita, hanimili b'yachid v'lo b'tzibur. That whole concept that a chatat, here again, the metu is going to be two different. Chatat shemetu ba'aleh, a sin offering that the owner dies, is b'mita, meaning the animal is left to die and there's nothing you could do, you can't sacrifice it. That's only for an individual sin offering. It's not true for the community offering. And that would be the answer. Okay, that's how Rav Papa answers this question. The question is, where does Rav Papa get this from? Okay, that's the Gemara is going to struggle with this. So while his answer seems very simple, there's no chatat, right? the chatat is not meita for the tzibur. So how do we deal with this? Menale l'Rav Papa. Where does he get this from? So we're going to have 3 attempts. Okay, here we have a pasuk, right? The children, this is a pasuk in Tehillim, okay? But the children take the place of the father, which sounds like, okay, so the father's not there to do it, the children can do it. And that's why this works in a tzibur. But that doesn't really make any sense because that's talking about an individual. If we take this pasuk to mean what we think it means, that the children can take care of their father's sins by giving the sin offering, it shouldn't just be in the tzibur that we should permit it. We should permit it for an individual. And we know it's not true for an individual. It's one of the 5 chataot that don't work. So that clearly is not the pasuk. Eladukia de Rav Papa's second option, Misi'ir de Rosh Chodesh. The Shiur on Rosh Chodesh, every Rosh Chodesh, we bring a Shiur Zimichav Chatat. That was the whole subject in the beginning of Masechet Shavuot, for those who learned it, on Tumat Mikdash v'Kodeshav, or, right, there was a whole range of opinions what exactly it's brought for. De Amar Rachmana, Maitemi Tumat Lishkan. Where was the money taken from? From the money collected from the half shekel that they collected in this starting from Adar. Now, they would be Tormim Talishkat, they would take all the money and take the money from there in the beginning of the year, buy animals for it, and then they would sacrifice it on Rosh Chodesh. Now, between the time they designate the animal until the time they sacrifice it on Rosh Chodesh, right? Hamaitu, now here's Maite, die. Hamaitu Lehumi Yisrael. People in the meantime probably died, right? So you take the money that was communal money that was brought from everyone in the community, and now some of the people are no longer alive by the time you bring the korban. Now here's maitu bring. The ones who are left, how could they bring it if some of the owners of it are dead? Okay, same thing as our case, right? The people are dead. How can you bring it for people who are dead? So here you have a communal offering, sin offering for the community. Even though some people have died, you still bring it. That's a good proof. Gemara doesn't like this proof. Midami, they're not similar. Are they? Right? Midami is, are they really similar? No, not really. We don't know for sure that people died. In other words, it's not like every single month someone in the community died, even though depending on the population, maybe it would be. But it's not definitive that somebody died. But in this case, 70 years later, for sure the people who sinned are dead. So you can't compare those two. If it's safek, maybe people died, we could see you could still bring the korban. But if definitely people died, it doesn't make sense. Okay, third. Elatama de Rav Papa Mehach Dichtiv. From last week's parsha, Egla Rufa. The parsha ended with Egla Rufa. What's that? Somebody dies in between 2 cities. You're not sure who killed them. So you have to do this process. And what does it say there? Kaper la'amcha Yisrael asher padita Hashem. Atone for the people of Israel that God redeemed. What did they learn from this pasuk that God redeemed? I was redeemed by God? Ru'ya kaparaso shetechaper al yotzei Mitzrayim. This atonement will atone for those who left Egypt. So now we have the sekes of the parat of the Egla Rufa atones for people who are way dead, right? Died a long time ago. How do we know this? Midichtiv asher padita, because it says that you redeemed. Who redeemed? Redeemed in Egypt. So what do you see? It can redeem people from before. To which they ask, midami. No, that's not the same. Hatan kulu itinun migo de mechapra chayim mechapranami ametim. But they say they were all there. In other words, that atoned for the people from the Egla Rufa ceremony, right? The people who actually allowed this person to be killed. That's the whole idea. Because it works for them, it also can cover past sins of people who are no longer alive. So once there's somebody there, right? So it can also atone for them as well. But in our case, mi'avu chayim, they're not alive anymore. To which the Gemara says, inachinami. What do you mean? They are alive. The people from the time of Zedekiah, now we're going to change, okay? I think there's 2 different ways to read this sugya. Whether either this is coming to explain the way it works, even according to Rav Papa, or, like I see on the Shatnstein, they say they actually change Rav Papa. They reject Rav Papa completely. And they say, forget Rav Papa's answer. It's not the right answer. But they give a different answer, which is, the people from Zedekiah's time were actually still alive. Okay, so the premise of our question, they were dead, is not relevant because they were actually still alive. Alternatively, I think that you could answer this as some were alive and therefore it worked for those and therefore it could also atone for the ones who were still dead. I think there's two ways to read this. In any case, let's read what they say. How do we know they were still alive? It says so in the pasuk. Okay, interesting. They didn't think about this before. But look what it says in the pasuk. V'rabim me'akohanim v'aleviyim v'rashei avot. You have to read the whole pasuk. The Gemara doesn't quote it all. Okay, it's Ezra Gimel Yud Bet. So many of the Kohanim, the Levites, and the heads of the community, Hazkenim, the elders, you ready for this? Asher ra'u et habayit harishon biyasdo ze habayit beinehem. Okay, they saw the bayit rishon when it was still up. Okay, so they were still alive. Now, what were they doing, these people? Bochim b'kol gadol. They were crying. So the elders who were from the time of the first temple were at this moment, and they started crying. And Rabbim and the others, okay, a lot of other people, what were they doing? They were screaming happy sounds. So we have these two sounds going: the crying of the elders and the happy screams of the young, the new generation. But what do you see here? They were still there. Okay, now they say, so there were still people alive, but now they say v'lo Rabbim havu, but they weren't. Maybe they weren't the majority. And if they're not the majority, how could you bring this paralem davar shel tzibur when the majority of the people who sinned are not the majority of the people? To which they answer, haktiv. Okay, you have to read. It's a correction here. Ve'ein ha'am mikirim kol truat simcha lekol b'chi ha'am. They didn't hear the sounds of the happy rejoicing because of the sounds of the people. Okay, what happened? The people who were crying were louder, which means, okay, not always, but they must have been more. That's their assumption. They must have been more, even though it sounds crazy to think about, that the elders that were left from before 70 years ago were still more than the people who were born after. Hard to imagine the reality of this, but they learn from the psukim that it sounds like they are. And you could hear it even in the distance. So there's your answer. So now we're going to explain what happened here. They were still alive. So the whole premise of it, that's why I think the Shansin says they reject the Republic, because in the end they said the people were still alive. The whole concept was they were dead. Now they say, no, they were actually alive. Okay. But theoretically, you could theoretically say, since some were alive and it covered some that were dead already, maybe. But, okay. Now the Gemara asks one last question on this, which is, V'hamizidin havu. But wait, the people who worshipped idols in the time of Zedekiah wasn't that they were following an erroneous ruling of the court. They were intentionally sinning. They were worshiping idols. That's why the whole destruction happened, right? Part of the reason. So now you don't bring a korban for mazid, and it's not a parlin davar shel tzibur, to which they answer, Horayot sha'aita. This was a unique ruling. Okay, Horayot sha'ah is a way that we say this doesn't have to conform to any of the rules we know already. There was a unique ruling that the people have to bring this kind of korban, and they're going to further prove it. Now we're going to get back to that crazy, insane number of sacrifices they brought. Hachinami mistabra, makes sense to say this. Dilo temach. If you don't say that, elim tishim b'tisha, kvasim shivim b'shiva, the 96 rams and the 77 sheep, keneged me. What were those for? I mean, that doesn't belong in a parlin davar shel tzibur normally. Ela Horayot sha'aita. That must be because of a Horayot sha'ah. Hachinami will answer our question Horayot sha'ah. And now that we answered our question this way, this actually can go back and answer the previous two questions as well, which is, right, if you say, if the tzibur died, how could we do it? Oh, Horayot sha'ah. If you say this doesn't match Rabbi Meir, because he says only the beitim brings, oh, Horayot sha'ah, that they were going to bring 12 this time. So that now resolves all your other questions in a different way. So with that, our braita, remember, we brought this braita to question. Rabbi Meir doesn't seem to fit in here. What do we do with him? And we answered either they sinned 12 times, right? Or now you could say maybe it was just a Horayot sha'ah, a unique case where they said bring 12, but not really learning from the earth to anything else. It doesn't have to fit into all the other rules. And the other two questions we had about it, number one, didn't the people die? And how can you bring a sin offering when the people died? And also the second question, weren't they intentional? Right? Okay, so we resolved everything. Now we're moving on to a new braita. Tanu Rabbanan, which again, we're going to try to figure it out. In this case, as I said in the first time, this had to fit in with all the opinions because it's a pasuk in the Torah. Now, in the end, it didn't, because we could say it's Horayot sha'ah and it was unique and it doesn't have to fit in. But the original was, we have to fit this in somehow. This braita, we're going to do something different, which is say, this braita is giving a ruling. It has nothing to do with a pasuk in the Torah. It's just saying this is the law. And which Tanaitic opinion does it match with? It doesn't have to, it's not like, oh, it doesn't match with this one. That's a problem because it's just a braita. You could say the braita is one Tanaitic opinion. So the question here is going to be, which Tanaitic opinion does this go with? Tanu Rabbanan, Meit echad min hatzibur chayavim, echad mibeitim pturim. If somebody, okay, so now we have a classic case of parling davar shel tzibur. The beitim ruled, the people followed, majority of the people. Now we want to bring a korban. But what happens? Either one of the people in the community died in the meantime, which is likely that would happen, or one of the court judges died, which is less likely because there's only, let's say, 71. So if one of the community dies, you're still chayavim. That has no effect on bringing the korban or not. But if one of the judges dies, you're exempt. So the question is, who does this go according to? Montana. Amar Rav Chisda, Amar Rabbi Zera, Amar Rav Yirmiyah, Amar Rav, Rabbi Meir, he da'amal, beitim mivi'im velo tzibur. Okay, this one's actually going to work very well with Rabbi Meir. Why? Very simply, because Rabbi Meir says the court brings the parling davar shel tzibur and not the people. So you simply say, hilkach, meit echad min hatzibur chayavim, dahakayim kule beitim. It's irrelevant that one of the people died, because they're not bringing the korban anyway. Who's bringing the korban? The court, and the court's still alive, so they bring the korban. Meit echad mibeitim ptulim, dahavi lechatat, meit echad min hashutafim, umishum hachi ptulim. This is not a tzibur. Okay, if it was a tzibur, remember we said also if the tzibur dies, at least we saw this opinion before, maybe it's irrelevant, right? You could still bring the korban. But if you have a jointly owned sacrifice, let's say you and I jointly own a sacrifice, and then I die, you can't go ahead and bring it, okay? Because one of the shutafim died, or at least that's what we think right now, okay? So he says here, according to Rabbi Meir, the Beit Din brings it, and they're shutafim, they're joint owners, not tzibur, because not the whole community, it's just this group of 71 people. They jointly bring this. One of them dies, you can't bring it, because if one of the owners is no longer alive, the sin offering can't be offered. Okay, so that fits with Rabbi Meir very well, because remember, Rabbi Meir said, just the court brings this one par, and that par is a jointly owned korban by 71 people. One died, can't bring it. Okay, we could have ended the sugi here, but Matkifla Rabbi Yosef, he decides to make our lives a little trickier, complicated. He says, Rabbi Shimon. Why don't we hold like Rabbi Shimon? And what Rabbi Shimon say? The court and the Beit Din, right? We have each tribe that sin brings and the court. So why would this work? Well, the Amar Beit Din Matzibur, right? Both of them bring. Meit echad min hatzibur chayavim, because of the previous sugya, de ein tzibur meitim, right? It's a different reason why the tzibur. According to Rabbi Meir, if one of the tzibur dies, we don't bring the sacrifice. Why? Because they don't even bring the korban anyway. They're not owners in the korban. But according to Rabbi Shimon, you could say, we just learned in the previous sugya, the whole thing of one of the owners dying is irrelevant for a communal offering. This is a communal offering. So the tzibur dies, it's irrelevant, right? They'd still have to bring. And the Beit Din dies because exactly what we just said, right? So that's Rabbi Yosef. He wants to say it's a chatat of shutafim of joint owners. And just like we said a minute ago, a chatat of shutafim is in brought, right? If one of them dies, you don't bring the korban. And then that would work. To which Abaye says, why didn't they say that? Because Amar Ale Abaye, and this is going to be a big issue of dispute between Abaye and Rabbi Yosef here, or unclear issue. Sham'ina leila Rabbi Shimon de Amar chatat shutafin eina meita. Just like the chatat tzibur eina meita, we heard that Rabbi Shimon holds, and that's why we couldn't explain this to Rabbi Shimon, that if it's a chatat of the tzibur, or if it's a chatat of shutafin, it's like chatat of the tzibur, and it's eina meita. Okay, it's not left to die. And that's why this couldn't be, because if the court said, right, if one of the court dies, then you would still bring the korban, because it's just like one of the tzibur dying. And this says they're exempt from the korban. So that's why Abaye says this doesn't match. Okay, so now we have these two approaches. Does Rabbi Shimon hold chatat shutafim is left to die, right? Meaning, again, left to die means no one can ever bring that animal again, and therefore no one even brings the offering at all. The animal has to be left to die, which means the offering can't be brought. No one can bring that. Or, which would have fit then this braita could be Rabbi Shimon. According to Rabbi, no, that's not Rabbi Shimon's position. Now, how does he know it's not Rabbi Shimon's position? Because we're going to bring another case of a chatat of shutafim that is not brought. And then he's going to say, eina meita, that is brought, and that's going to prove that chatat of shutafin is brought. But then Rav Yosef's going to say that's for a different reason. So if this is the rule, then we can have, but Rav Yosef's going to say that's not the rule. Titania, as it says in a braita, let's see. Par v'sir shel Yom Kippurim. Now, the par v'sir bull offering, the Kohen Gadol brings, but he's a shutaf with all the other Kohanim. It's really owned by all the Kohanim because it's a korban brought for the Kohanim. Sha'avdu, let's say it got lost. This is going to be the same kind of thing, right? Is it left to die or not? V'yifrish acharim tachtehim, and then they brought a different one in its stead. Yamutu kulam, all of them have to die. Divrei Rabbi Yehuda. He clearly thinks shutafin has to die. But Rabbi Elazar, Rabbi Shimon omil, it's left to graze, and then you can redeem it. Why? Lefisha ein chatat tzibor meta. Now, it doesn't really mean tzibor. What it means is a jointly owned korban is shutafin. It's a little confusing because the Gemara calls it tzibor, but it's really shutafin. So he says, here's my proof. Also, shutafin is like tzibor, and it's not left to die, and that's how we know, because look, it's left to graze, which means you can replace it, which means, for example, in our case, where it wasn't that they brought another korban in its stead, but the person died, you should be able to bring it, okay? The korban could be brought. So that's a bai. Amalei Rav Yosef, Kanim Chamati, you're trying to prove from that case. That case is a unique exception to the rule. That doesn't teach the rule, it's an exception. Why? Because of a special limud in the pasuk. Shane Kohanim de'ikre kahal. Kohanim are called kahal. How do I know they're called kahal? Dichtib ala Kohanim al kol am kal yechaper. In Vayikra Tetzayin, where it talks about the Avodah Yom Kippurim, it says this is going to be atoned for the Kohanim, and the other one's going to be atoned for the nation. And now we have the Kohanim and the nation next to each other in the pasuk. We're going to learn one from the other. The Kohanim are a kahal, just like the people are a kahal. They're their own community in and of themselves. It's like tzibor. It's not shutafin. If you say it's shutafin, then you can learn from there that shutafin ain't a meta. But it's not shutafin, it's tzibor. And then it falls into tzibor, and shutafin, you could still say, is left to die, and you can't replace it, and you can't do it for them, which is what Rav Yosef's trying to prove. So now we're going to question what Rav Yosef's answer here, that the Kohanim are a kahal. Now, he says Kohanim are a kahal right here in this pasuk, specifically for Yom Kippur. But they want to say, wait, if you're going to call the Kohanim kahal, Rav Yosef, elame'ata netu par bahorah, we're at the top of Amud Bet now. Then, if they're a kahal, okay, go back to yesterday's sugya. What do we learn? Each kahal has to bring a korban in the parlim davar shel tzibur. So, if each kahal and the Kohanim are a kahal, then the Kohanim should bring their own, right? We should have the 12 tribes and the Kohanim. And if you want to say that, you have too many shvatim. In other words, you got to get rid of a shevet somewhere, because we said 12, not 13, right? The 13 was only for if you bring also the beitin, but it should be the 12 tribes, the beitin, and the Kohanim, if we're going to call them a kahal. So Ela Am Rav Acha bar Rabbi Yaakov, he's going to try to respond for Rav Yosef, and he says, Shivto shel Levi lo ikre kahal. Okay, he's going to say, no, the Kohanim are not called kahal for the sake of the parlim davar shel tzibur, because Shevet Levi isn't even considered kahal, and the Kohanim are part of Shevet Levi. How do we know? Dichtiv, hineni mafrecha v'yerbiticha v'netaticha lakal amim v'chulei. Okay, I'm going to make you a nation. Okay, and it says there, and you're going to get the land. So here, kahal goes with getting land. Koshe yesh lo achuza ikre kahal, v'koshe en lo achuza lo ikre kahal. So they say, no, the Kohanim don't count for the parlim davar shel tzibur, because even Shevet Levi doesn't count. Okay, now we have a problem. If Shevet Levi doesn't count, right? Why not? Because none of them get nachala, and therefore they're not called kahal for that purpose. So there's this drasha specifically for Yom Kippur, but for other things, no. So don't worry about the parlim davar shel tzibur. And that resolves Rav Yosef. They say, wait a minute, if you don't count Shevet Levi, im ken chas v'lu shnei asar shvatim, then you only have 11, right? You got rid of a shevet. You're stuck with 11. So that doesn't make sense. So Amar Abai, this is a little confusing, because Abai is actually now responding for Rav Yosef, even though before he was against Rav Yosef. Ephraim and Menashe Reuven v'Shimon Yudli. Okay, he answers this. Don't worry. In the parlim davar shel tzibur, we have 12, because Ephraim and Menashe count as 2. Okay, you might know this, you might not know this, but every time there's a count of 12, sometimes it's Levi and Yosef, and sometimes Yosef splits in 2 and Levi is not there. So basically, they say for parlim davar shel tzibur, it's Ephraim and Menashe, it's not Levi. And that's how we have 12, and that's why the Kohanim don't bring their own, because they're part of Levi, and Levi doesn't even bring. So of course, in parlim davar shel tzibur, no. In the Par Kohen Agadol Yom Kippurim, they're considered a tzibur for that purpose. Okay, and that resolves Rav Yosef. Now, Rav is going to question this answer. Now we're just in an Inyani thing, just in terms of the flow. We resolved Rav Yosef by saying Ephraim and Menashe are Reuven and Shimon. Right, they're like Reuven and Shimon. Right, that's the bracha that Yaakov says. And from there, we get that they count as 2 tribes. Amar Rava v'haktiv al shem achehem yikru b'nachalatam l'nachala ukshu v'lo davar achel. Ephraim and Menashe are only like Reuven and Shimon, 2 tribes, for nachala purposes, because it says, in the name of their brothers, they will be called in the nachala. So for nachala, for getting nachala, they were called, but not for anything else. To which the Gemara says, "V'lo, what do you mean? It was for other things. They also got, right, when they camped, they had their own, Menashe had a flag and Ephraim had a flag, and they had their own separate sections. So they say either two answers here. Kenachalatam kachanayatam. Okay, the camping was it was parallel, right? It was their nachala in the desert. So either that, or kedei lachlok kavod l'dgalim. Or, right, let's say they took them out, okay? Let's say Ephraim and Menashe were one, and it was just Yosef. What would happen? Well, Levi was in a different area in the camp. They didn't camp in the flags on the sides. They were in the middle. So they would have 11. It would be imbalanced. It wouldn't be, right? You want like a nice balanced camp, 3, 3, 3, 3. You would end up 3, 3, 3, 2. Wouldn't have been balanced. Maybe that's why they split them there as well. Okay, that resolved that. Second question against Ephraim and Menashe are separate, just for Nachala, right? Rav's question. Also the Nisiim, they each brought their own, in the Chanukah Mishkan, they each brought their own. Now that was also just to give respect for the Nisiim. It wouldn't have been respectful to not do that. Tanya, as it says in the following braita, Shlomo asashi v'ayimei Chanukah, when Shlomo dedicated the temple, he did 7 days. Umara Moshe lasat shnei asar yimei Chanukah. Why did he do 12? Moshe, kedei lachlok kavod l'Nisiim. So we'll take the same thing here and say it would have been disrespectful not to give them a place. Okay, that was just to resolve this difficulty that Rabbi raised. In any case, Rabbi Yosef suggested that perhaps Rabbi Shimon said Chatat Shutafim is Meta, and then is Eina Meta, and maybe you could have read it like that. Chatat Shutafim Meta. That's why. It is Chatat Shutafim Meta. That's why the court, right? That's why the court basically one of them dies. We don't bring it anymore. Abaye says maybe that's not what Rabbi Shimon holds, okay? And then we had the back and forth and reasons to go one way or the other. Now the Gemara says, okay, well, we didn't really conclude anything there. I mean, we did kind of raise questions and answer them, but in the end, my Havilah. So what's the story? Is a chatat of shutafim meta or not meta? Do we hold like Rabbi Yosef? It's meta, and therefore and then you could read that according to Rabbi Shimon, because the court, one of them dies, doesn't bring because they're shutafim, they're partners, and because of that. Or do we go like Abaye and say, no, they're really at Tzibur, and that's why. And, the Chatara Shutafim, no, it's not Rabbi Shimon, right? It's really only Rabbi Meir, the part that only the court brings it, and that's why. But Abaye says, Rabbi Shimon really thinks Chatara Shutafim ain't a meta proved from the Yom Kippur. So do we learn from Yom Kippur or do we not learn from Yom Kippur, basically? So we're now going to bring another source. From here, we're going to prove it. And from here, we're going to get to the Chamesh Chataot that I mentioned before. Tanya, Rabbi Shimon Omer, Chamesh Chataot Metot. Now, here's the big 5. Okay, you ready for the 5? These are things you're going to have to remember. There's a Rashi Tevo Vitimna with an ayin, and that's the way you remember these 5 things. But for another time, Vlad Chatat. If I designate a sin offering, and it's a female sin offering, and the female gives birth before I slaughter it for the offering, that offspring has to just be left to die. Okay, this whole thing is a little difficult in terms of animal rights and all that. I'm just going to leave that issue aside right now. We don't have time to deal with it. We'll get to this a lot more time. Not that I have an answer for it anyway, but it's difficult. Tmurat chatat. You're not allowed to do tmura, which is say, oh, I found a different animal. I'd rather use that one instead of this one. But if you do it, the second one is sanctified as well. So let's say I designate an animal for a sin offering, and then I want to swap it for a different one. I'm not allowed to do that. But if I did it, it's actually effective. So the second one actually has to be left to die because there's nothing I could do with it because it's for a sin offering. If it's, let's say, a burnt offering, I can offer it as a voluntary burnt offering, but there is no voluntary sin offering. So also it's left to die. Chatacha metu ba'aleha, this is the main one we discussed. The owners died. That was the whole thing. The owners, plural in the Tzibor case, but this is an individual case, or maybe both. That's the whole question. Chatacha nitkaplu ba'aleha, what if they already got atonement from a different one? That was the case where the animal got lost and I replaced it and then found the original. And chatacha rashnata. There's a certain, I think it's a 1-year-old. It has to be within its first year. And if it passes the first year, then you can't. Okay, it might be first or second. Either which way, it passes the time you're allowed to. So I designated, but didn't bring it in time. And now the animal's too old. First year, thank you. So I would have to leave it to die. Now, those are the 5. Here comes the thing, though. The braita says, now, there is no vlad chatat in a korban tzibur because all the korbanot tzibur of chatat are all males. They don't have offspring. So it's impossible. Shein tzibur mafrishim nikeva, because the communal sin offerings are not females. Tmura is not effective. There's a braita that says, or maybe a Mishnah, tzibur and shutafin ein osim tmura. Okay, both the tzibur, and this is going to be important for our purposes, and people who jointly own, their tmura is totally ineffective. So that's not relevant for them because the next one won't be sanctified, the substitution one, the one I substituted. And we already learned tzibur doesn't die, right? Because there's always other people, right? There is no such concept as the tzibur dying. So 3 out of the 5 are not relevant in a tzibur case. But the other 2, I don't know. Maybe they are relevant for tzibur. I didn't learn about this. You might have thought maybe those are left to die in a communal offering. But but we say we learn what's not explicitly clear from what is explicitly clear. Meaning, those 3 are only in an individual. Those 2 must also be only for individuals. So we're going to learn from those 3 to the other 2. But wait, those are impossibilities, those 3. It's not that the law just doesn't apply, it's that the law can't possibly apply. Now, the law could possibly apply by the other 2, so why should you learn something that could possibly from something that could never, ever exist, like a male giving birth, right? So, Rabbi Shimon b'chad makom gamir. No, because they say Rabbi Shimon learned it again. This goes back to what I started with. This whole thing, Chamesh Chatot Mitot, is a halacha l'Moshe Sinai. So what does that mean? It means he had a tradition about them. So basically, the tradition was all one complete unit. So basically, they go hand in hand. If it doesn't apply for the 3, it doesn't apply for the 2. And from there, you learn chatat, right? All these 5 chataot are only for individuals, not for community. Okay, we weren't looking for that. We were looking for shutafim, right? Not tzibur, shutafim. But take this logic and apply it to shutafim, which is shutafim are in the 3 korbanot we described. The par l'mdavshel tzibur of the court is the shutafim. The par Yom Kippurim is shutafim. Okay, and there's what's the other case? Second, I wrote it down for myself because I just forgot right now. And the par and Shiur of Avodah Zarah. Okay, that's the par l'mdavshel tzibur, the 2 different types. So anyway, those are all male sacrifices. So they're not applicable for the Vlad. And they're also, I already told you that shutafin can't make tmura. So the tmura is not relevant. So the same can be said for the shutafin. And from here, actually, we go against Rav Yosef and say the chatat of shutafin ein meta. It's not left to die. That law doesn't apply. And that's why you can't explain it. Okay, that's according to Rabbi Shimon, because this is all Rabbi Shimon. So that's why they didn't explain the braita according to Rabbi Shimon. Because the braita goes according to the opinion that once one of the shutafim dies, all the rest don't bring it, because it doesn't get brought. But he thinks they would have gotten brought, and that answers our question. And with that, Hadran alahu rubetim. So what we did in this part of the sugya, and then we'll just quickly finish up by reading the next Mishnah and a bit of the Gemara, but what we did in this part, just to review, we have one braita that we brought to say this doesn't accord with Rabbi Meir and question Rabbi Meir. We resolved that, asked a few other questions, and then resolved them all with some other answer. And then we brought the second braita to say, could this second braita, right, first we said it goes according to Rabbi Meir, could it go according to Rabbi Shimon? And then we kind of thought maybe it could, but in the end, it can't. Okay, new Mishnah. Hora Kohen Mashiach. Now we're moving on to the next, okay, starting the second chapter, moving on to the Kohen Mashiach. This is the Kohen Gadol who sins. Now, the Kohen Gadol's sin is like this. Same, and you can listen to Daf Mishalahem from last week. They talk about this comparison and actually have some interesting insight about it. But right now, we'll just stick with the Pshat. A Kohen Mashiach is a Kohen who is the Kohen Gadol who is anointed. Get more to that later. It's parallel to the Par l'Mdavshel Tzibur, where there has to be a teaching and then an action based on the teaching, but all of it is done by the Kohen Gadol. The Kohen Gadol teaches an erroneous ruling, and then the Kohen follows it. So Horeh Kohen Mashiach Latzmo Shogeg, accidentally taught himself wrong. V'asa Shogeg, and then he did Shogeg, Mevi Par. Shogeg v'asa Mezid, or Mezid v'asa Shogeg, but if one of the processes was intentional, like made an erroneous ruling on purpose, knowing it was wrong, but then forgetting and then doing it anyway, forgetting it was wrong, or the opposite, making an erroneous ruling, but then when he did it, he realized the ruling was wrong and did it anyway. Then patur, then he's not going to bring a korban because one of the processes was mazid, intentional. And that's what I just said, right? It's parallel to the Par l'Mdavshel Tzibur. So the Gemara says, Shogeg v'asa Shogeg mevi par pshita. Okay, wait. Obviously, Shogeg and Shogeg mevi par. You don't need it to tell us that. So Amar Rabbi, this comes to include an additional case, and with this we'll finish. Kigon shehora v'shachach me'ez tam hora. He made an erroneous ruling saying, let's say this chaylev is permitted, but then forgot why he thought it was permitted. And then when he goes to do the action, he forgot why. So now, he says, listen, now I don't remember why I permitted, but I'm going to go based on what I permitted. You might have thought, now, if he had remembered the reason, maybe he would have realized, oh, you know what? I was wrong about that. Maybe maybe he's really mazed here because he didn't remember the reason. How do you remember the reason? Maybe he would have figured out. Maybe that's more like, it's not really intentional, but it's closer to intentional. You'd be exempt. That's why it tells you shogeg and shogeg. Even if you're shogeg now, even though you don't really remember the original ruling, why you made it, you're still considered shogeg and you bring a korban. And that's like a very unique, strange case. Okay, with that, we'll finish for today, and we'll pick up here tomorrow and figure out where we get the source that it's like the Paralim Gavar Shel Tzibor for the Kohen HaMashiach, because that's going to be different than the Nasi. The Nasi just sins without issuing a ruling. First of all, Nasiim didn't issue rulings. The Kohanim did. Kohanim, right? We saw in last week's parsha. The Kohanim were like or I think it was also this week with the Zakei Mamre. The whole, you go to the Kohen and the Shofet, Asher Yeh B'Yamim Mehem. They were really like judges. So anyway, we'll get back to that tomorrow. Wishing everyone a Shavua Tov and Shishma B'Salot Tovot. And remember to register for the Siyums certainly when the registration for the English one goes up. Right now, the Hebrew, if you want to come to the Siyum in Israel, it's on the Hebrew site on the homepage. So you can find it on the Hebrew side. And for those on Zoom, there will be no Zoom Wednesday, Thursday, Friday this week. But the Shiurim will go up as usual. Have a good day, everyone.